Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Today's program is brought to you in partnership with Jewish Insider. You can sign up for Jewish Insider's daily kickoff by visiting www.jewishinsider.com. We are honored to be joined today by Dr. Madeleine K. Albright, former Secretary of State and best-selling author. In 1997, Secretary Albright was named the first female Secretary of State and became, at that time, the highest-ranking woman in the history of the U.S. government. Secretary Albright has been a featured speaker twice at AJC Global Forum, including in 2011, when she and Joschka Fischer, German Foreign Minister and Vice Chancellor from 1998 to 2005, opened the conference. And in 2018, Secretary Albright signed the AJC-crafted bipartisan statement on the importance of the Transatlantic Partnership and the values that bind liberal democracies. Secretary Albright will be in conversation today with Jason Isaacson, AJC Chief Policy and Political Affairs Officer. After we hear from Jason and Secretary Albright, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org, that's questions plural, or use the Q&A chat feature in Zoom. Before turning it over to you, Jason, I would like to recognize AJC Prague Director Tomas Kraus, who Secretary Albright in her book titled Prague Winter describes as her dear friend and recalls the experience of the Jewish community in the period before and during the war, where Tomas played host to Secretary Albright and her sister Kathy during their research. Tomas, thank you for helping make today possible. I would now like to introduce Jen Pardee, AJC Director of Development in Atlanta, who she too has a unique connection to Secretary Albright, to offer brief opening remarks. Jen?
Thank you, Daniel. To have called one of the most influential and admired women in the world Aunt Madeleine has been my privilege, and it's an honor to introduce her today. My family ties to Secretary Albright began when she and my mother met in the 6th grade after her father brought the family from Czechoslovakia to New York for his work at the United Nations. Later, Secretary Albright and my mother reconnected at Wellesley College, where their lifelong friendship alliance was formed. I have wonderful memories of many vacations spent with the Albright family. Her twin daughters are my age. We learned to ski and swim together, listened to our parents discuss politics, and were bridesmaids in each other's weddings. My mother and I attended her swearing-in reception as Secretary of State in 1997. My son grew up knowing about the woman he called that crucial lady, his grandma's best friend. Recently, I had the pleasure of visiting Secretary Albright in her Georgetown home. While I was groggily drinking my morning coffee, she had been up for hours completing her daily ritual of reading 4 newspapers, checking Twitter, and texting with staff about her schedule for the coming week. And what a schedule. Since leaving the State Department, Secretary Albright has not even considered the word retirement. As she writes in her new memoir, Hell and Other Destinations, she was intent that the next stage of her life be even more interesting than the last. Interesting indeed, her many roles over the past 20 years include author, college professor, business executive, political advisor, defender of democracy and human rights, and champion for women's leadership. Madeleine Albright is a crucial voice for this fraught moment. We are delighted she is joining AJC today to discuss the state of the world and where America must go from here. Jason, I turn it over to you.
Jen, thank you very much. And thank you all for joining AJC's Advocacy Anywhere conversation, leading in a time of crisis with one of America's and the world's foremost advocates for democracy, the rule of law, and responsible leadership, former Secretary of State and former UN Ambassador, Madeleine Albright. Secretary Albright has inspired generations of leaders with her clear-eyed views of the critical issues facing the United States and the free world, and indeed on the parts of the world that are not yet free. A refugee from post-war communist Czechoslovakia who, as a very young child, had spent the war years in Britain while her native country was under Nazi rule. She knows more than most of us about those unfree parts of the world. Now, 75 years after the end of World War II, mankind faces a different sort of crisis, a pandemic that has taken hundreds of thousands of lives and stalled the global economy. But that public health crisis and its economic fallout are hardly the only threats facing the world. What we intend to spend this hour discussing with Secretary Albright is the range of challenges confronting America and its allies, and the role of leadership in addressing those challenges. Let's begin. Secretary Albright, in your latest book, which Jen just mentioned, Hell and Other Destinations, a 21st Century Memoir, a central theme is the rise of democracy in the immediate post-Cold War period, and then the threats to democracy in more recent years. Through your work in the National Democratic Institute and other vehicles, you have worked tirelessly to plant and nurture the seeds of democracy, often with such partners as the late Senator John McCain. What happened to slow democracy's progress, and can this tide be reversed?
Well, thank you. And before we get serious, I have to thank Jen for that introduction. To be introduced by somebody whom I call another daughter is really fun. And everything that she said in terms of our friendship and our interaction of our families is true. And I'm delighted that she introduced me. What could be better? So really, in terms of the things that have happened, I do think, and I am a professor, so I have to take a little bit of time answering that, is that there have been, I've talked about two megatrends and their downside. And clearly, one megatrend is globalization, from which most people have benefited and taken advantage of the capability of being in other countries, knowing foreigners, having different supply chains. But the downside of it is that it's faceless. And people don't know what their identities are. And we all want to know what our identity is where we come from and what we're doing. The only problem is if my identity hates your identity, and then that becomes nationalism, and it grows into hyper-nationalism, which is very dangerous. The other megatrend is technology, which has really been remarkable. And I always like to talk about the Kenyan woman farmer who no longer has to walk tons of miles to pay her bills because she does it over a mobile phone. And then she can be part of her country, society, start a business, run for office. The downside is it has disaggregated voices. We don't know where we get our information from or how social media works, and it has divided everybody. So what we're dealing with are societies that are divided. And then what happens, and I wrote in a previous book called Fascism, A Warning, which has a terrifying cover to it and a terrifying title, because it definitely is a warning about how the divisions in societies are taken advantage of by demagogic leaders who do more to exacerbate the divisions. And while there is, fascism is not an ideology, it is a process for taking power. And the basic way of taking power is for this demagogic leader to identify himself with one group at the expense of another that then become the scapegoats. And so that is what is going on, the exacerbation of the divisions and the difficulty of democracy delivering in order to overcome those divisions.
But did democracy promise too much in the post-Cold War period?
Well, I think that I guess in retrospect, you might say that. On the other hand, I happen to believe, I continue to believe, that most people want to have a voice in decisions that are made by their leaders, that there has been a social contract for a very long time. You can go back to the 19th century or 18th century, in which people gave up some of their individual rights in order to get some services and protection from a state. And what had really happened is that both sides have let down the contract in many different ways. But democracy is the basis for how people talk with their leaders and how their leaders listen to them. And so I do think in many ways it's an aspirational way of doing government and dealing with the social contract. I don't think it promised too much. I think it has trouble delivering on everything.
And I guess social media even exacerbates some of the problems.
Absolutely, no question.
You've titled the course that you teach at Georgetown University, America's National Security Toolbox. What are the principal tools that America wields to exert its influence in the world? And as both a practitioner and a scholar in this field, how would you assess our effectiveness in wielding those tools?
Well, let me just say, I decided that course really is based on the time I spent in the government, first in the Carter administration and then in the Clinton administration. And the first time that I kind of literally came into contact with how America reacted to something they didn't like was when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979. And I was in the Carter administration working in the National Security Council staff. And I was at a meeting where we were trying to figure out our response to how we would react to, we knew we couldn't get the Soviets out right away, but how to punish them. And it was a crazy meeting because it was an interagency meeting, and one agency after another said, well, we can cut off the Russians' fishing rights, or we'll have a grain embargo, or they said we can do a démarche to Moscow saying you're doing the wrong thing, or somebody suggested that we not send our athletes to the Olympics in Moscow. And I thought, this is the most disorganized thing I've ever seen. Don't we know what's in the toolbox? So when I started teaching in the 80s, and then even later after I'd been in the Clinton administration, I decided that I would teach a course. And I said that foreign policy is just trying to get some country to do what you want. That's all it is. So what are the tools? And as powerful as we are, there's only a limited number of the tools in the toolbox. And the bread and butter tool is diplomacy, bilateral and multilateral. And then there are the economic tools, which are either aid and trade or sanctions when you cut all that off. Then there is the use of force, either threatening it or using it, and intelligence and law enforcement. We have now added technology and the cyber tools. And so I take each tool and I go through various case studies to show how they work, and that the art of statecraft is being able to use the tools in cooperation with each other to support each other. And so the question is how they are used by the powers that be, that would be the president, at the direction or against whatever Congress has suggested. But I do think it's a good way to kind of look at how one can carry out foreign policy.
Well, as a former Secretary of State, how are we using the diplomatic tool in that toolbox today?
Well, I think not very well, I have to say, because one of the things that truly is important for any administration is to think about what it is going to do in the time that it's in office. And there has been a process for that. You were asking about, had democracy promised too much after the war? Well, the bottom line is that the system that was set up, the National Security Act of 1947, was a way to kind of regularize how a president made decisions. And it is a process, and it's been used a little bit differently by everybody. The bottom line is, at the moment, it is unclear whether there is a process. And that, and what has happened, and it makes the usage of the tools difficult, is the lack of any predictability. Now, unpredictability can occasionally be a tool, but it can't be unpredictable all the time, because you are clearly trying to accomplish something with your foreign policy, your national security policy. And if you keep changing the message or the messenger, or it goes through different systems than a normal way, it is very confusing. And I think it has made what is already a very dangerous situation much more dangerous by its unpredictability and kind of a decision not to use the appropriate tools or use them backwards.
Let me focus on one particular area of foreign policy that you have particular expertise in and also personal experience in, and that's transatlantic relations, transatlantic partnership. In September of 2018, Madam Secretary, you signed an AJC statement reaffirming the transatlantic partnership. We published it full-page ad, and it was signed by dozens of global leaders, including yourself. And in 2011, as was mentioned earlier, you participated in an AJC Global Forum where you talked about transatlantic relations, transatlantic tensions. The 2018 AJC statement referred to the rules-based international order. It referred to confidence in NATO and respect for the European Union, a defense of democratic principles and institutions, and AJC with 8 European outposts, including our Transatlantic Institute in Brussels, has been focused on transatlantic unity for decades. What are your views on the central challenges to transatlantic unity, and how can we resolve them?
Well, let me say that, first of all, as was mentioned, I was born in Europe. And I say whenever I meet with Europeans that I was born in Europe as they were. I just happened to have been raised in the United States. And so I could tell them what I think they need to, what they're doing wrong, what we can do to work together more. They've been very honest discussions about how this relationship has evolved. I think it is the most important relationship internationally that we have, because in so many ways it's based on a similar value system. We had a lot to do with the organizations that were set up, NATO specifically, the rules that are part of the international system, but it isn't easy. And I think that I've sometimes talked about it in terms of family relations. So immediately after the war, the Europeans were like sick children who were willing to take any medicine that we were offering. Then they became teenagers and they wanted to know where their allowance was and that they wouldn't do any chores. Then what we were trying to do was to develop an adult relationship with them in terms of really discussing what needed to be done together. And that has gone through some difficult times. But I do think that it is the basic relationship that is necessary for whatever the world order is, and how to work together through the systems that have been set up, the European Union and NATO, and try to solve problems together. So one of the things that did happen when President Obama decided that he wanted to rebalance to Asia, by the way, the United States is not monogamous. We are an Atlantic and a Pacific power. When Obama decided on what he was going to do, there were a lot of my European friends that called me up and say, "You've abandoned us." And I said, "No, we haven't. You used to be the problem. Now you are part of the solution, and we have to do things together," which is what I thought we were going to do. But there has been a great deal of animosity because of the unpredictability of the United States and a certain amount of U.S. acting as a victim rather than the most powerful country in the world, and looking for cooperation in a number of areas. So there's no question that the transatlantic relationship, I think, continues to be the most important one, but it's under a lot of pressure. Some of it because of our doing for the Americans. By the way, I was, before I was under house arrest here in Washington, I actually had been in Munich for the Munich Security Conference, and the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense spoke, and they were kind of like people from another planet. They were not talking about things that needed to be done together. And so we were not very welcome there, the United States, when I do think we need to be looking at ways to cooperate in a very difficult world with countries that are democracies for the most part. I am concerned about some of the undemocratic things that are taking place in Europe, and it's very hard to criticize them when we are having some problems of our own.
Specifically on NATO, which you've referred to, you were tasked by President Obama and Secretary Clinton early in the Obama administration to work with our NATO allies on a reassessment or reimagining of NATO, and you produced a report in May of 2010 called NATO 2020, and here it is, 2020. Have the recommendations that you were putting forward for NATO's mission in this new global environment played out, and how do you assess the role of NATO today?
Well, actually, they haven't played out because things are very different. And just to say, what was happening in 2010 was that it was an anniversary of NATO, and there was a new Secretary General, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, and a Dane, and it was decided that every country would name an expert to advise him. So as you mentioned, I was named the American expert. And then he decided that even though there were 28 countries in NATO at the time, that only 12 countries would have experts, automatically irritating 16 countries. And then he asked me to chair it. But the agenda was very different because NATO had been active, but it had been active only in what is known as out of area, not among its members. So it was active in Afghanistan and it was active in the Balkans, and there was no longer any Soviet Union. And so there really was an attempt to try to figure out what it would do in that kind of an environment. And it was determined that NATO had more partners than it had members. There were all kinds of things that could be done around the Mediterranean. The interesting part was that one of the issues we were trying to deal with was whether the cyber attacks on Estonia, which is a completely e-country in every way in terms of using technology, and there had been an attack on their system, whether it was an Article 5 violation. And Article 5 is the most operative aspect of the alliance, which is an attack on one is an attack on all. And at that time, it was decided that it couldn't be an Article 5 because we couldn't trace the genesis of a cyber attack. So there were any number of things that made the the whole strategic concept that actually was accepted by NATO itself, but a little what we in the State Department called OBE, taken over by events. So what happened was that the Russians actually took over a piece of Ukraine by sending little green people into Crimea and the rest of it. And all of a sudden, NATO did, in fact, have to react to something in area in terms of what was going on. Ukraine is not a member of NATO, but it certainly affected the countries around. And all of a sudden, American troops and others have been deployed into Poland. And so there is a new study going on about what NATO should be doing now and what are its responsibilities towards it. NATO is not just the most powerful military alliance, but also one of democracies. So there are a lot of things that need to be talked about. And this is under consideration now, another strategic concept for NATO.
But your assessment of the Trump administration's insistence that the NATO participants, NATO members, live up to their commitment to devote 2% of their GDP to defense, that's pushed countries in a more positive direction, I think, along the lines of what American presidents have been asking for some time. How do you assess NATO's our European partners' share of responsibility for their own defense?
Well, there's no question, and frankly, I was very much a part of the kind of way that the United States treated NATO at the beginning and the expansion of NATO. And we made very clear at the time that NATO was not a charitable organization. It was something that you needed to participate in. And it was important to participate fully in it, and not only in terms of the 2%, which is not just money, but in terms of where troops are and what they do. I, however, think that the method that Trump chose was something haranguing and made everybody uncomfortable. Some countries have upped their contribution, but I think, like many, he's misunderstood what the money goes for. It isn't paid to the United States. And we have NATO and are part of NATO, not just in order to protect our European allies, but for America's national security. And so I think it's very important to understand they do need to do their part. They need to be contributors and partners. And NATO does need to be clear about what it needs to do. And I've gone around and been celebrating the anniversary of a variety of things from NATO. And I think it's a vital and viable alliance. But like everything, it needs to always be looked at. The new Secretary General Stoltenberg has been to the United States. He's spoken in Congress. I think there's every attempt to make it seem, which it is, a partnership.
Let me get back to the issue of leadership, which we were talking about at the beginning of our conversation. In last week's AJC Virtual Global Forum, I was privileged to moderate an election debate between spokespeople for Republican and Democratic outlooks on foreign policy. And I asked our debaters about U.S. global leadership, the driving force in post-war institutions that have been the guarantors, if imperfect guarantors, of global peace and security since the Second World War. Specifically, my question, intended really to stimulate discussion rather than to get a silver bullet response, was whether the U.S. is ordained or destined to be the global leader forever. What's your response?
Well, I think what is interesting is the United States doesn't like to be the world's policeman. That is not the natural kind of aspect about the United States. And when I teach, I teach a lot about the history of American diplomacy. And Walter Russell Mead's book, for instance, Special Providence, about what the United States has done in terms of foreign policy. But it is not our natural kind of sense that we want to boss everybody around. I do think, however, that it's important for us to be a part of things. So President Clinton was the first person to say we were the indispensable nation. It's just that I said it so often, it became identified with me. But there's nothing about the word indispensable that says alone. It means engaged. And partially, he said it because he wanted to make clear we needed to be engaged, because as you remember, he said, it's the economy, stupid, which meant that he was going to have to do things domestically, obviously. But domestic and foreign policy go together, and the U.S. needs partners, which is kind of the theme of what I just finished saying on NATO and various aspects, and not to just be the sole one that is doing things. There's always the question whether there's something called American exceptionalism. I, as a refugee, really do believe in American exceptionalism, but it doesn't mean that we don't have to obey rules, that we don't have to be a part of something, and that being a partner is something that we don't want to do. Americans don't like the word multilateral. It has too many syllables and it ends in an ism, multilateralism. But it just does mean partnerships, and I think we benefit from them. And so I do think we don't want to boss the world around, but it's good for American national security to be a partner.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I have just one or two quick other questions I'd like to pose before we open it up to participants. You've been at the center of democratic foreign policy debates for most of 5 decades. Across that period, the U.S. Israel relationship has grown into a true alliance with broad bipartisan support in Congress and overwhelming public endorsement as well. In recent years, though, there have been challenges to that support, both among the Democratic rank and file, and to a lesser extent among Democratic office holders. Can this alliance continue to command broad bipartisan support in the public and in the political establishment?
Well, I have always believed and considered myself a very strong supporter of U.S.-Israeli partnership, working together on any set of issues, and a natural kind of relationship because of our value system and the importance of Israel, and that partnership. And it's not just rooted in shared interests, but in shared values. And I do think we need to work together. I think that clearly there is not everybody agreeing on every part of it. And it is a relationship that goes through a variety of strains at different times. I have witnessed some of them. By the way, it's the 20th anniversary of the Camp David that President Clinton did. And I often, I say, I can't see this audience, but I know there are a lot of people on. And if I were to ask you, any of them, whether they'd like to go to Camp David, they'd probably say yes. But I can say after 2 weeks in the rain with the Israelis and Palestinians, I don't care if I ever go back. It is a very complex relationship over the status of what the Palestinians are doing. I happen to believe in a two-state solution and a way of dealing things through talks. And that was the kind of system that we operated under during the Clinton administration. But I do think that there are divisions now. both in the Democratic and the Republican Party. And some of it has to do with the treatment of the Palestinians or in terms of various policies. But I would say that on the whole, most Americans really do believe in a strong Israeli-American relationship because of the origin of Israel, but also because they happen to be located in one of the most complicated and dangerous parts of the world in the Middle East.
Madam Secretary, let me ask you one final question before I open it up. We have witnessed in recent years in the United States and especially in Europe abroad, we have witnessed an increase in anti-Semitism and other bigotries, but specifically attacks on Jewish institutions and individuals in a number of places. Do we have adequate tools to defeat this virus? And of course, there's a larger question about hate in general and bigotry in general. And of course, the United States, just in the most recent weeks, has been experiencing its own reflection and confrontation with longstanding bigotry against the Black community in this country. So what is going on in the global confrontation and the domestic confrontation against bigotry in general? Anti-Semitism, but also other forms as well.
I think to go back to what you asked me initially about what is going on in the world, and I was saying that the divisions have been created and that demagogic leaders ally themselves with one group at the expense of another and then make that the scapegoat. And that is something that has been going on with the rise of authoritarian systems in order to find who is the enemy, what is the problem, whether the enemy is some of a people of a particular religion or ethnic background, or is it because they don't want refugees there, or they're always picking somebody whose fault it is. And I think what is interesting is to go back to the origins of fascism, which was through Mussolini. And he was the first fascist. And what he did was specifically work on the exacerbation of relationships and divisions, and carried to the horror show of Hitler that literally did more than just talk about scapegoats. So I do think that this has been now exacerbated by the divisions, that instead of trying to mend the divisions, there are those leaders who are trying to make them worse. The best quote in my fascism book actually comes from Mussolini, who said, if you pluck a chicken one feather at a time, nobody notices. And there's a lot of feather plucking going on right now. By the way, you can't say those two words together too quickly. But there really are, some in the United States, some in other countries, an attempt to find who the scapegoat is. And unfortunately, too many times, it lands on anti-Semitism, which has also been exacerbated for venal, malign reasons. And so I do think it is something to worry about. And what we're now talking about in the United States, the systemic racism, we are seeing a lot of issues that are being made much worse by those who do not have democratic instincts, who are trying to figure out how to divide society more. So it is a very troubling and difficult time, and very important for people to speak out when they see things that are disgusting. And I think we are at a really incredibly important time where we have a choice in terms of what direction we move in, which is why I believe in democracy and relationships with countries that have similar values.
And we have the tools, we have the institutions to maintain democratic principles, to beat back forces of extremism and intolerance and anti-Semitism?
I believe we do have the tools, but they can't just sit there. I do think it takes cooperation among people who agree on things and have to take action. Democracy is not a spectator sport. It is something that requires people to state their views, to understand how the tools work. And we are about to be in a very important phase, frankly, with the elections, the kinds of various demonstrations that are taking place, the discussions that we're having, those that are taking place in a free and really cooperative atmosphere where people are trying to solve problems rather than to make problems. But there's no question, it's a very poignant and important time that is a period where we can make some very important decisions about how we want to treat each other, what this country is all about, what is going on in other countries, and to try to form relationships with those with whom we agree. But one of the hard parts about all this is listening to people with whom we disagree and try to find out what is motivating them and try to sort out what is happening. And then also, I'm often asked whether I'm an optimist or a pessimist. I'm an optimist who worries a lot. And the reason I'm an optimist is because of the next generation that are looking at things, I hope, somewhat differently. Things are going to be very different after this crisis, this health crisis, which has brought on a lot of other things. And some of the issues that we are talking about and have to do something about. This is not a period to say we'll just get over this. This is a very serious point where people of goodwill have to try to figure out how to solve some of the most hideous problems that are out there for our societies.
Secretary, thank you. I've gone way over the time that I was going to spend with my own questions, and I'm sorry that I've stolen time from participants in this conversation. So let me ask Daniel to jump in with questions from our other participants.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Madam Secretary. We have an extraordinary number of questions coming in, all the way from Turkey and Iran down to the pin you're wearing today. So we'll hold off on the pin for now, and I'll get to that question. But let me first start with a question from Simon Fink in Brussels. You wrote in your latest book about the sanctions imposed during the Clinton administration against Saddam Hussein's Iraq, which you defended in your role as ambassador to the UN, and about how Saddam wielded those Western sanctions as a propaganda tool, protecting himself and his cronies while the Iraqi people suffered. Fast forward to today, and the maximum pressure sanctions now imposed on Iran. Can the U.S. succeed in driving Iran back to the bargaining table and forging a farther reaching agreement than the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action?
Well, I wish that we hadn't walked away from the AGOC. It was not a perfect agreement, but it was a good basis, and it has given an excuse to Iran not to abide by various parts, especially most recently inspections, which the Atomic Energy Agency has called them out for. But I do think that it's important to use the tools we have with the idea that maybe the next administration would go back to an AJOC. But we, in many ways, lost our credibility by walking away from an agreement. At the moment, some of our tools do have to do with Iran and sanctioning those that are involved with them or trading with them. And I think as well as trying to use some multilateral force from or multilateral influence from those that were part of the agreement to say that they, and especially what the UN just did on calling them out, on not living up to various parts of it. The problem is, if we're not living up to certain parts of it, it gives them an excuse. So us walking away from that agreement has been, if I might put it this way, a gift to those that do not wish to abide by what we were trying to do, is to make sure that Iran did not have nuclear weapons.
Daniel?
Our next question comes from David Simon in Houston. Turkey represents a real challenge for the U.S. in global relations. It is a NATO member and thus in some ways an ally, yet they are also an apparent adversary to the EU and their neighbors, Greece and Cyprus, not to mention Israel. What do you believe we should do in handling the situation with Turkey?
I have to say, I think that it is, and I know everybody hates the word complicated, but it is one of the most complicated relations ever. One of the issues that I got very interested in when I was in office, first at the UN and then as secretary, was the fact that Turkey was being excluded from a lot of things that might have changed some of their disposition in terms of seeing themselves as a modern country. And by the way, I took my grandchildren to Turkey And my youngest granddaughter at the time, you know, she was 7 or 8, said, "I understand Turkey perfectly. We spent the night in Europe and had lunch in Asia." And that does explain a lot about Turkey. And what I think has happened in many ways, because they have been in many ways disrespected by a lot of the Europeans, which was one of the issues that I got involved with when the Europeans, when I told them they were making mistakes, and they told me to mind my own business. But it turned them away in many ways from looking at things from a Western democratic value. Erdogan was elected fair and square. It's just that he then overdid his power. I think it is unbelievably confusing what they're doing in terms of buying equipment from the Russians, of being on various sides in either North Africa or the Middle East to just suit their own purposes, their relationship or lack of with the Kurds. And I think that one of the hardest discussions is how do they behave within NATO? But it is one, I think, of one of the issues that is daunting in so many ways in terms of how complex relationships can be. Erdogan is very much a part of my list of authoritarian leaders that is doing more and more to divide his own society, and therefore creates problems for the Turks as well as for the neighborhood.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Daniel?
Our next question comes from Dr. Scott Lesensky. Many of us will never forget what we learned about your family background around the time you became secretary, including that unforgettable photo of you at the Pinkas Synagogue in Prague's Jewish Quarter, looking at the names of your grandparents listed among those martyred in the Holocaust. 75 years later, after the end of World War II, do you think we have done enough to ensure Holocaust remembrance? And how do you assess American efforts to create a meaningful, effective genocide prevention policy, which you yourself championed and President Obama adopted in his first term?
Well, by the way, I went to the Czech Republic with my grandchildren about 3 years ago now, and we went to Terezín, and I dedicated a plaque there to the 26 members of my family that had died in the Holocaust. I know that Thomas Kraus is in the audience, and he is somebody that helped me and my family very much sort out our very complicated story. I'm very grateful to him and to the Czech Jewish community. I do think that we never can do enough in terms of making people remember the Holocaust, because there are still people around that are Holocaust deniers that create very serious and damaging issues for the countries in which they operate. And I think that we need to do everything we can to keep saying and doing, passing various kinds of agreements and laws in order to make sure that people never forget. The problem is that we are operating in this rather peculiar atmosphere where what is going on is creating scapegoats, which is something that I talked about a bit, and we have to call it out because we know where it leads to. And people that have experience and understand it cannot allow there to be calling out any group and saying there are fine people in that group, and trying to be very careful about how we say things and make sure that people never forget that scapegoatism leads to a dreaded disaster.
Daniel?
Our next question comes from Jackie Fredman in Washington, D.C. You've spoken about the role of the EU and NATO, but didn't really mention the United Nations. Is the UN still a viable tool for advancing U.S. interests?
Well, let me say, I have been saying that people and organizations at age 75 need a little refurbishing. And this is the 75th birthday of the United Nations. I do think, and a cliche is that if it didn't exist now, we would reinvent it. I have to say, I've just finished reading the current issue of The Economist that goes through what the problems are at the UN, what are the things that need to be done. But I do think that what needs to be done, there are things that need to be changed, some of the bureaucratic aspects, some of the way that the organization works, but it will not happen if the US is not a part of it. I know what happens when we don't pay what we're supposed to, which was one of the problems I had when I was there, because we were in arrears on our peacekeeping operations, and Congress unilaterally decided we weren't going to pay what we were owed, leading our best friends, the British, to deliver a line in the General Assembly they'd waited more than 200 years to say, which was representation without taxation. And what has happened now, in terms of a totally counterproductive move, was for President Trump to say we weren't going to be a part of the World Health Organization. It needs fixing, it needs changing. But us being AWOL means that the Chinese are filling the void, and we will not be able to make the kinds of changes that are necessary in a system that does need work on it because of its age.
By the way, before you ask the next question, Daniel, let me just point out that, of course, Thomas Kraus, to whom you referred, Madam Secretary, is AJC's representative in Prague, and a good friend.
Yeah.
Daniel, next question.
Sure. And before getting to the next question, I should also note that Secretary Albright, you mentioned the United Nations at 75 coming up. We have a program with Ambassadors John Negroponte and Ambassador David Pressman on Friday for those over 1,000 people listening today, Friday, June 26th at 1 p.m. Just a quick plug. Our next question comes from Dr. Barbara Truger. In what way, if at all, do you see the position of Secretary of State having changed since you served from 1997 to 2001?
Well, first of all, let me say, in order to do diplomacy, you actually need diplomats. You need people in the State Department. In many ways, the behavior of this administration towards professional diplomats, who are not just foreign service officers, but also dedicated civil servants, has been atrocious. Not supporting them, not understanding what their jobs are, and a number of them have left or been told to leave. And so I do think that there needs to be a building up of the State Department, which also means that there needs to be money allocated to the State Department. I do believe in a strong military, but the budget for the Defense Department is somehow around $671 billion. And the budget for the State Department, when I last saw it, was kind of more in the $40 billion range. I know that I was so honored, especially as a refugee, to sit behind a sign that said the United States. And I know that Secretary Pompeo has in fact said that he wanted to return the swagger to the State Department. There's no evidence of that, by the way. And I think that it is the oldest department in the American system. It is the senior department, and it needs to reflect what American national security policy should be in a system that is understandable in terms of how the different departments work together. But it's very hard to tell in terms of what is going on aside from personal relationships. And I don't think the State Department is playing the role that it needs to at this point, especially when there's an awful lot that needs to be done.
Daniel, next question.
Sure, we have time for a few more questions. Our next question comes from Stephanie Furman in Vancouver, Canada. Throughout your career, you have sought to break down barriers to women's advancement as the first woman to be Secretary of State and an inspiring barrier breaker yourself, and you have celebrated women's leadership. Lately, there have been news reports of the greater effectiveness of women heads of government appear to have achieved in confronting the coronavirus pandemic. To what do you attribute this advantage?
Well, it's interesting because I have been asked about this, and I do think that there are a lot of aspects that bear talking about. First of all, women, and these are generalizations, women have not come to power by being egotists and telling everybody how smart they are and that they're smarter than everybody else, but mostly women have come to power because of hard work and dependability and understanding who their colleagues are. Then I do think that women, by biology and by what we do, are people that are multitaskers because we have so many things that we do have to do at the same time. And I think that has allowed us to have peripheral vision in terms of what problems are down the road. And again, as I say, this is a gross generalization. I think men, in many ways, are better about thinking about one issue in more depth. But I do think that women are good at the multitasking. The other part is that women actually do try to support what they believe in by facts and science and look into what the problems really are. Then I also do think women are natural caregivers. And to go back on something I was talking about, divisions, most mothers do not try to pit one group of their children against another group. So those are kind of the generalizations. I do find interesting that the countries that have been able to do something about the virus are ones run by women, beginning with New Zealand and Taiwan and Germany, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, Finland. It's very interesting. And I do think it has something to do with the qualities that I mentioned.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Daniel?
I think we have time for just one more question, Jason, before I turn it back over to you. And this, as I alluded to previously, we have lots of questions about. So from one of our listeners, you have written and spoken about the sometimes sharp, sometimes funny diplomatic messages you have been able to deliver via your collection of ubiquitous pins. I see you're wearing a beautiful dove right now. What kind of pin does this fraught moment in America call for? And if you can explain a bit about the pin that you're wearing today as well, that'd be great.
Well, let me just say how this all got started. I was at the UN and somebody had asked about sanctions, and it was that the Gulf War had been translated into a series of sanctions resolutions. And my job was to make sure that the sanctions stayed on Iraq. And so every day I said perfectly terrible things about Saddam Hussein, which he deserved. He'd invaded Kuwait. And all of a sudden, a poem appeared in the papers in Baghdad comparing me to many things, but among them an unparalleled serpent. So I started wearing a snake pin when we were talking about Iraq, and this was noticed by the press. And then the other ambassadors would say, what are we going to do today? And I said, read my pins. So during this period, what happened was that I have this dove, and this is not the original one. The original one is in a collection that's going to the State Department Museum for Diplomacy, was given to me by Leah Rabin. And I wore it when I gave my first speech on the Middle East as Secretary of State. And then one time when I came to Jerusalem, there was a present for me, which was a necklace of doves with a note that said something like, it takes more than one dove to make peace in the Middle East. I love to wear my dove pins. There's always something very important in what it is signaling in terms of how actually to try to deal with the myriad issues that are out there that are making this a very, very difficult time. We need more doves.
Let me jump in, Daniel, if I may, and just pick up on what the Secretary has just talked about the search for Middle East peace. You mentioned earlier on this, it's 20 years since the last major U.S. peace effort at Camp David. It's been I remember being on the White House lawn early in your term as the U.S. ambassador to the UN when President Clinton presided over the signing of the Oslo Accord. So at this point, 5 months now after President Trump has offered his own peace plan, what are your thoughts on the possibility of moving toward a two-state solution? Is that still a realistic alternative? Is there any other alternative for Israelis and Palestinians?
Well, I do think that there has to be something that is a two-state solution. But I think the following thing, and you've talked about the history, and I'll never forget being on that White House lawn when that happened, and what a momentous time it was, and a thought that things could be different. And President Clinton and Dennis Ross and the Middle East team worked endlessly on trying to figure out what to do. And the bottom line is, I can tell you from being an observer and a participant, is the United States has a lot of imagination, a lot of knowledge about how peace can be made, and what are sometimes called bridging ideas of how to try to solve something. Those exist, and they continue to be out there in a number of ways by either private organizations or the people that are working with the government. Nothing can happen if the political leaders in the area don't want to do something. And I think that that is one of the things that have to be remembered, that we had ideas, we came very close at Camp David when we were there, and it's clear that Arafat was not capable of making the decision. But I do think that some of the things that have happened with the Palestinian Authority, some of the politics that are taking place in Israel. And the U.S. can have a lot of ideas, but nothing can happen if the leaders in the region don't want to do something.
Madam Secretary, this has been enlightening and inspiring, as we hoped and expected it would be. Thank you again for being in this AJC Advocacy Anywhere webinar. Thank you for your continuing openness to AJC and your consistent support for the principles that AJC stands for. I have to say, in a kind of a political disclaimer, AJC, of course, is a nonpartisan organization. And I know that you have tried very hard to kind of skirt that line. You and we have somewhat different functions in this universe. We very much value your insights and your input, and thank you again for appearing in this AJC forum.
Thank you very much, and I'm always honored to participate in this. And if you can always make sure that somebody like Jenny introduces me, that will be fine.
Thank you very much, Madam Secretary. Daniel?
Thank you.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Madam Secretary, for that fascinating discussion. I also want to thank our audience for joining us and showing your commitment to the topics discussed here today. In these unique times, while so many of us are separated from our family and friends, AJC is still bringing us together on the issues that matter. Please consider making a donation to AJC so we can offer you more programs like this one. Visit ajc.org/donate. Our next Advocacy Anywhere program will feature Senator Chris Coons and Senator Ted Cruz, both members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who will join AJC to discuss the bipartisan effort that they are leading to promote U.S. Israel collaboration in the fight against COVID-19, combating anti-Semitism at home and abroad, and other issues of importance. This program will take place tomorrow, Wednesday, June 24th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. I hope you will join us. Thank you again for joining us today. Please stay safe and healthy. Goodbye.